But bringing this over to a very interesting discussion that I'm sure you're all interested to see, the vaping discussion. This is very, very telling. I found this to be, this is just so interesting to me. Now, this discussion is something that I've been talking about from like the very beginning of all this, at least because I thought it stood out as an odd reality. And this is what I said was, this is exactly what I've been saying from the start. It was clear this wasn't vaping. And don't forget, these vaping clusters, as they called them, which doesn't make any sense because that's what you call a virus that's spreading, clusters, were taking place in close proximity to Fort Detrick right after its admitted leak, just before the COVID-19 illusion began. And as Willie Brown says, dude, you called this on day one, props. And Whitney says, I sent this story to Ryan and said exactly that. She's the one that sent this to me. Right. So appreciate Whitney always fighting because I was very happy to see this. I appreciate her throwing it my way. It's just, and now again, I want to be clear though, by covering this and even saying that I said this from the beginning is not to imply that I am then stating as a matter of fact that one, this is exactly what we're told it is, COVID-19, and two, that that's even what was circulating then. I'm just simply saying that it's interesting to see what I was considering as a possibility and being censored for being now put back at us as something that's being mildly confirmed. Very, very interesting. Let's look at the document. AI suggests U.S. vaping illness cases from last summer was actually COVID-19. A supercomputer called Tiane-1 proposed that an American EVALI patient, which was that whole EVALI thing, it was that, vaccine injury, that's the acronym they used, who developed pneumonia last year actually had COVID-19. What if COVID didn't appear in Wuhan first, sometime last November? What if the coronavirus actually first popped up in, guess what? North Carolina, USA, right? For those that forgot all this stuff, isn't that telling? North Carolina University. Like we've gone over all this in past shows. EcoHealth Alliance. I'm going to make a couple more points about this briefly as we go through it. But this was too much to ignore. The timing of when the leak happened in Fort Detrick, like early 2020-ish, I forget the exact date. I have it up here coming up. And how this, there was stuff going on. And how this, and then we see these vaping illnesses circulating around. And we saw these cases popping out around the country, right? And then we saw, and it all leads in this direction. And of course, in North Carolina, where the material actually came from that went to Wuhan, China, like when they claimed they were when they claimed they stopped their gain of function research, but then simply offshored it to China and continued to pay and work with them. Right. It's ridiculous. People that want to make this a partisan discussion and ignore half the story. That's what the two-party illusion does to you. North Carolina, 3 months before China got hit. That's what a supercomputer programmed to detect COVID-19 proposed after analyzing medical data from a U.S. patient last August. The unidentified American patient who lived in, North Carolina, was treated by doctors for the vaccine issue or e-cigarette and vaping associated lung injury. Now, just to be clear right off the bat, they never confirmed that was the connection. Never. And I'll show you in the mainstream articles themselves. In case you forgot, that's the other lung illness that the CDC obsessed over before the coronavirus pandemic blew up. Isn't that telling? And why would you obsess over, realize, and why would the CDC even be involved, guys? The CDC, if this is some kind of an issue that's a chemical that's causing issues in your lungs, and that was what they came right out of the gate with, why would the CDC be involved? Wouldn't this be some kind of an FDA issue? Yeah, it really would. But let's continue. In case you forgot, the CDC was obsessed over this, and just to add this now, remember the discussion points we had, and they'll probably come up briefly again. The discussion things that we saw around this, that there was weird discussions around this, that Alex Azar was trying to point out that there was an issue with COVID-19 in January, which already blows their whole narrative out of the water, which we didn't know what was going on. They didn't tell us, right? But then Trump said, and this is on the record, all he wanted to talk about was vaping. Now, what does that actually mean? Why? Why was that the focal point while we were literally seeing that? I think there was something happening there. At the very least, that's where he was being driven because we didn't want to. There's a lot of uncertainties here, but there's clearly something going on. It says the computer looked at the U.S. patient's CAT scans, and this is so telling to me. One feature in particular stuck out to the supercomputer. Guess what, guys? White blotches that resembled ground glass opacity. Remember that discussion that I kept driving in and said, why did that disappear? Why was that everywhere? Why was the only thing we were being told is this ground glass opacity is very clearly an issue with COVID-19, and it just disappeared? I have not heard one comment about ground glass opacity since this discussion came out, and it got real quiet. Why is that? Is it no longer? But no, it's very clearly still a thing. So why are they not talking about it anymore? Like even in passing, there's not even a reference to it. Doesn't that seem odd? So here's the point. They saw ground glass opacity on the lower parts of the patient's lungs. Similar blotches appear in the lung images taken from COVID-19 patients, which is true. Was this the wrong spot? Yes. Let me move this real quick. I believe this was over here, I think. Jump back. So here is an interesting study that I just kind of stumbled into when I was researching this. They're talking about ground glass opacity, right? And they're saying that similar comes from the lungs. Well, actually, I forget. Let me read a little bit further down and we'll go to that study. Now, it says the patient was just one of 5 in North Carolina who were also diagnosed with the same, what they claimed was a vaccine injury, or excuse me, a vaping illness injury, I guess. It was so strange, right? This is supposed to be injury. This isn't an illness, but they're reporting it as the same thing around the same time. None of the patients tested positive for the flu, the common cold, or any other pathogens, but they all said they vaped. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. This was the correlation that they honed in on. Now, that could be because that's what they wanted to use as a cover story, or it could be because it was a correlation, but doesn't always mean causation, especially because you realize how many people vape in this country. So the reality is you could probably tie that with, well, look, they all drive cars. Maybe it's the car causing it, right? You could always do that and make something connect. But it's interesting when you dive into the actual, like the ground glass opacity, the locations of these things, the fact that they were calling them clusters and illness. And I think that there's something telling about whether, like, the testing here. I mean, there's something around this whole discussion about why they were doing this and the way that they acted around it. All 5 patients experienced the same symptoms. Guess what? Difficulty breathing, nausea, vomiting, and fever. All were hospitalized for hypoxemic respiratory failure. 3 ended up in the ICU due to life-threatening shortness of breath. Doctors had to put one of them in a ventilator. It all sounds very familiar. This finding this is from the doctor who's challenging this. This finding on chest of the CAT scan, ground glass infiltrates is highly nonspecific and is seen in many types of infections. Furthermore, Davidson doesn't believe his patient suffered from COVID-19 since a coronavirus outbreak never occurred in North Carolina before, during, or shortly after the patient was diagnosed. Right. So he's just taking at face value that because they didn't report that didn't happen. You see, this is the kind of trust in authority that MIT document was just talking about. That people like us are going, well, okay, just because they didn't tell us it was happening doesn't mean it wasn't happening. Historically speaking, that is like if the government doesn't tell you, it doesn't mean it's not happening. And history has shown that very clearly. So his assumption that, well, we didn't see it, right? But didn't you just say you were seeing a bunch of cases? Couldn't you then ask yourself whether that was what it was and they just didn't know, or they hid it, or they covered it up, right? He just won't even think about that. But here's the interesting point, as he says, it's totally non-specific to this. Well, here's what the study found. This is 2020, August. False ground glass opacity and suspicion of COVID-19. Beware of the technique for performing the CT. Now, this is what's interesting, though. It says ground glass opacity is a CT sign that's currently experiencing renewed interest since it's very common in patients with COVID-19. Now, again, so my point, it was everywhere. Ground glass opacity, we all saw it when it started. That was the big talking point. GGC, it's all over the place. And if it's still very common, where did it go? Why is the discussion gone? I think that's telling. I think it's because it connects back to this point, which I don't think they want people looking into. However, this sign is not specific to any disease, it says. So just so we're clear, we know that this other things can cause that. Now it says, besides the possibility of false positive ground glass opacity related to insufficient inspiration during the acquisition of the chest CT should be known. So what they're saying is that people, this is another point before I get to the percentage, is that they're claiming that in the beginning, there were probably all sorts of cases that were called COVID-19, but weren't, simply because of the ground glass opacity. Add another one to the list that creates all these different things. Now, that in a weird way seems to kind of like counter what we're getting at here, but this is just the finding of the study, and it's good to be honest. Make sure you see the full discussion. But the point is, when we get to the percentage, you'll see what I mean. It says, we report the case of a 36-year-old patient suspected of COVID-19 and in whom a second acquisition of a chest scan was necessary to remove false ground glass opacities that erroneously supported the diagnosis of COVID-19. Now, going down a bit, this seems to contradict what they're saying up there. Pulmonary ground glass opacity is sign found in between, guess what? 63% and 86% of patients with COVID-19. Up to 86%? Why would that not be one of the first thing? So this is the point of when they were doing these chest scans in the beginning to find out. Why isn't that happening? Why are we jumping right to PCR tests with false positives? This is an 86% potential of people that have that. You see what I'm saying? There's something strange happening here. And this is apparently rampant in this issue that we're being told is COVID-19. The term is therefore increasingly used with COVID-19 by clinicians, although it is important to keep in mind it doesn't specify only COVID-19, right? So in August 2020, they were very clear. Most people are dealing with this. They're coming back, as he says, it's highly non-specific and is seen in many types. But doesn't that seem to kind of hide the fact that, yes, very clearly, 86% can have this? Odd, isn't it? But it goes on to say, to truly determine if the U.S. evaluated patient actually had COVID-19, doctors who need to screen the patient's antibodies. Right. Which, by the way, they don't seem to want to do. Right. They're available. But if they really wanted to find out how rampant it had been, they would have done this a long time ago. It's your choice. I wouldn't do it. I don't want anything that they're trying to test me with to be anywhere near me. But they could find out. And they would know. And I said this in the very beginning. Why didn't we immediately test people for these? See if they've had antibodies, because they didn't want to know. But they didn't want to find out this was in the United States before it was somewhere else, because they wanted to blame somebody else, just like the Spanish flu, which started in Kansas. Look it up. Now it says, but then it says, if they find antibodies for the novel coronavirus, then it's possible that the patient had COVID-19 and not the vaping illness. But it says, but even if the patient came down with COVID-19 back in August 2019, that still wouldn't explain why the first coronavirus outbreak surged in Wuhan, China. Again, because that's how they reported this. Like, we have to understand that. Like, again, this takes us to, let me see if I have that. Where did I put that? I hope I included that up here. Let me see. See what the icon looks like. Oh, the CDC. That's right. Okay. It's important to show this. Okay, good. I do have it right there. Well, I was going to jump to that actually. But so the point is to say, like, it's crazy that we can pretend that just because we're told and shown things on the media that means, well, that it happened there first because that's what they said. That's almost never the case. How do we know that what happened in North Carolina was not rampant and everywhere? And the only thing that was different was the media telling you that was going to kill you, which changed everybody's perspective, and everybody flipped out. And then people actually started getting sicker because they thought they were sicker, and on and on and on. Psychosomatic is a huge thing that they're not even discussing today, as well as the fact that the illnesses, there's all sorts of things that could add to this, but it's easy to frame it and create it, right? Such as flu, which maybe I'll just show it real quick and show it again. The reality is, you can see right here that in this time frame, right before it, this is 2019 into 2020, right there, which is horrific, right? So clearly, yes, something was happening in North Carolina and everywhere else, right? It's very bad, worse than we've ever seen before. I've looked back years and years and years. So the point is, what was going on there? And did they simply just not tell us about it? Interesting. Now, here are a couple of videos. I want to play just a quick little clip of what I was saying back on May 14th, 2020. Departing Health and Human Services Deputy Director Tevi Troy, right? After he left this. Tevi Troy, Health and Human Services, right? This is the guy that used to work for a vaping company before Health and Human Services. Strange. Soon took a gig as a high-powered lobbyist for none other than Juul e-cigarette company. Or, excuse me, afterward. Which, by the way, had run into some regulatory barriers as a result of the Tobacco Control Act, which had just been signed by then President Obama. An e-cigarette company. How does this tie in, guys? There is obviously some very weird tie-in here with whatever vaping has to do with, whether it's just a cover for where it started in the United States, or the fact that they intentionally made sure to leave open certain vape shops while there was actually decisions made by people in power that they were going to specifically make sure vaping shops were left open during this. How does that make sense? This isn't just, it's not, I could get pulled into this forever because I'm so fascinated by what this is. The idea that they covered this up and claimed that it was vaping when it really clearly seems to be something that's tied in with what's going on today. But all of these different examples.
of people, of Alex Azar of Health and Human Services trying to speak to Trump in January about COVID-19. And on record, quote, all he wanted to talk about was vaping. So now that we're seeing a guy clearly tied up with the creation of all of this stuff, tying back to the false flag lies of anthrax all the way back to today, who, I don't know, there's something weird with this. You guys have theories, you please reach out to me. But to me, it seems like I think there's something that's going to happen in regard to vaping that's going to tie in with this that hasn't happened yet. That's my guess, based on this, that this is part of the psyop. And there's a reason that this man works with this company, and this is part of the lies and things that have been being told. This is just off the top of my head. As I always make sure to tell you very clearly when it's something that's my opinion, something I'm theorizing about, which is part of the reason you're here, for us to think and talk and theorize and consider what might be possible. He took a gig as a high-powered lobbyist.
Okay, just on to the next point. For those that, I don't know why that would be confusing to everybody in the chat. I just clearly, and now I'm going to play my old video, which I said. So here's the same video, just to further on point. And this is what I found to be very telling about how the CDC was reporting on this, as if it was something, as if it was an outbreak, which is how they list it.
Is something that I still find very odd. Right? This is the front page of the CDC. And right up here on outbreaks, mind you, as in disease, virus, it still has listed lung injury associated with e-cigarette use or vaping. Why does that even make sense? What is the deal with why is it listed as outbreaks? How does that even make sense?
It doesn't.
I mean, first of all, remember when they first reported it.
Oh, it's weird. I'm talking with myself. No, it's strange because this is after they've already claimed that it was like the vaping, right? This is the point. They've already kind of pushed this off into the vaping discussion, vitamin E, whatever else they tried to claim, fake cannabis, even though, it's very strange. And they left this on there.
It was reported as clusters. That it was somehow spreading.
Clusters.
Even though that doesn't make sense based on the idea that it's a vaping material that's hurting your lungs. That's what that's what the ultimate claim was. Oh, it's THC. They never proved it, by the way. They'll say it themselves. That was their theory, that it was THC, fake THC cartridges. The point is, it's still listed as an outbreak. There's something weird about this. Now, I'm not going to push it even further because I know a lot of people think this is,
Well, coming back to today, well, certainly a little more interesting, isn't it? Seeing as how this is, and look, this could be wrong. It could be fake. It could be manipulated. But we do know clearly that an artificial intelligence computer that was set to do this, with the data in front of them, just they came to the conclusion that this was in fact COVID-19. Why? Because exactly the point that I was making, that the data in front of you is ridiculously pointing in one direction. Instead of going, well, here's what we think and we can't prove it, with no other connection other than it's vaping and lungs and that we thought there was a correlation. But yet on the other side, we have everything. We have the you could even go, that's what I'm going to do next, the Fort Detrick aspect of this that seems very relevant, but you have all of the same symptoms. You have all of the same, ground glass opacity and all the different things. You have the fact that they were very ill, the hospitalization, the ventilation, everything is the same except what they tell you this is. I don't know why we weren't asking more questions or anybody else wasn't asking any more questions. Now, this is an interesting video as well. This is just a clip from that Proletariat Heidi Claire 4 shares. This was September 13th, 2019 in Tennessee, of all places. Listen to what they say.
Down with these symptoms, and vaping was the cause that makes the most sense to their doctors.
So they don't know. They don't know. It just makes the most sense. Because remember, before this was seen, there was this really weird push by the mainstream media. Oh, vaping is dangerous, and vaping, and this is vaping. Whether that was because cigarettes or whatever else. Is it strange that they got vaping in your mind before this all happened? Then that was before we saw the other thing. It's just kind of strange, isn't it?
There are over 380 possible cases of lung illness right now nationwide. It's making people sick in 36 states and one U.S. territory. And
36 states, and they haven't even proven the connection all the way to today. And we're going to pretend like 36 states were all because of some hypothetical fake vaping juice that we can't actually find. We're children if we buy this kind of narrative.
sadly, 6 people have been reported dead. And they all lived in 6 different states.
6 people dead, right? With respiratory issues. Come on, guys.
So most patients told their doctors they do have a history of using e-cigarette products that contain...
Most? Really? So not even all of them vaped, but let's pretend like it had to be vaping all the way around, right? This is why, so they're spreading it somehow, even though it's not, it's vaping and an e-juice. Come on. Now, there was also the other discussion of whether this could have been something that was used to spread this, but that's, again, getting a little too far into the hypothetical, right? Certainly possible. But that was early on. That was one thing I was considering, that it's strange that they kept all the vaping shops open. Like, and that's not you can look this up early in the beginning of this. Out of everything they were doing, they were like making legislation to make sure vaping shops stayed open. Like, I don't even understand that unless you feel that there's something nefarious happening.
THC. Many of them said it was a combination of THC and nicotine, and only some said it only contained nicotine. Right.
So, oh, God forbid oh my God, they combined nicotine and THC. They're all going to die, right? Like, because no cannabis smokers ever been smoking cigarettes at the same time. God, these people are ridiculous. You know, see what I'm saying? Like, these people are so wildly out of touch. And that's what they think people are going to buy. Anybody anywhere who's even remotely, like, what's the word for it? Hip, I guess, like, who's experienced and dabbled in this stuff is laughing when they say, God, the combination of nicotine and THC killed people. Well, sure, they'd love to push the cannabis killed people line, even though that's a joke, an unbelievable joke that is shown to be false over and over and over. Not a single person has ever died from cannabis alone. Yeah, people can smoke cannabis, then, get in a car accident. That doesn't count. People can smoke cannabis and then take heroin and die, and they'll go cannabis. Nope, doesn't count. Just like, or like with Kratom, where Ben Swan showed clearly that they were reporting Kratom deaths. And when you dig barely past the surface, oh, look, this guy had a shotgun wound to the chest. That's not a joke. And they deemed that a Kratom death. This is how they operate. The FDA, the CDC, they are criminal deceivers. As an entity. Doesn't mean they're not individuals in there that may be trying to do things like the Spider Group, but they'll quickly get replaced by whoever's controlling this. And as they follow up here, they're just saying, yes, as I say, I'm talking about vaping illness, they're talking about Fauci just declared publicly that we don't fund any gain of public research or gain of function research in Wuhan. Really? It's just so stupid. Actually, this should have been the next one. Just to real quickly, I don't even think if there's anything. Oh yeah, I might as well show you this real quick. Let me just share the screen. I have to jump over to the incognito window because, Washington Post paywalls all their content because they're doing so well, Potential culprit found in vaping related lung injuries and deaths. Potential. All right, this is November 8, 2019. They never verified this. It says the discovery is a breakthrough that points to an oil as a likely culprit in the outbreak. The outbreak. Are you kidding me? That has sickened more than 2,000 people and killed at least 39. But yeah, guys, this thing they never connected or proved, we just forgot about. Anybody suspicious about that at all? Like we just didn't care to find out why they died? Has that ever happened? Like that's just so plainly false. They just want you to think that, yeah, CDC officials found vitamin E and an oil derived from vitamins and all 29 stuff. Yeah, so that's what's killing them, right? God forbid. No, why don't they just say vitamin D and make it even more obvious, The point is, this is so plainly not real. I'm not even saying that stuff can't end up being harmful. The reality is they want you to think that THC was the catalyst here, and that's ridiculous. Ridiculous. It's simply not the truth. And I can tell you, obviously, that what we're staring at here, I wonder if I just close this, if it will revert back. Nice. Why is this out of focus? Here we go. It couldn't be more obvious to me. And I think this is what happens when you actually take the time to look through the evidence and not just read what mainstream media has to say to you. But again, the point was that he's now just openly talking about how we didn't do that. We're not funding any gain of research, or excuse me, gain of function research. Well, let's take a quick little dance through what's been going on in Maryland, around Fort Detrick. 5 Maryland residents have developed this is back in August 28th, 2019. Okay. Now, this is exactly this is the time frame we're talking about, from rolling from end of 2019 into 2020, and then again from 2020 over into 2021. Or no, excuse me, 2019 over into 2020, and then the reopening of this building in 2020. Right. So the time frame is what we're talking about, is just before the alleged beginning of what COVID-19 is that they tell us, right? But remember that there's been plenty of groups that claim this started long before that. And now we have an AI computer saying, well, that was also COVID-19. It begins to start to flesh out a bit. It says 5 Maryland residents have developed a respiratory illness related to vaping in the past 2 months. They're putting this on vaping in Maryland, in Frederick, Maryland, right? In literally the same town as Fort Detrick. Interesting. And again, right at the time when they had some issues. August 2019, research into deadly viruses and biological weapons at U.S. Army labs shut down over fears that they could escape. Why? Because they had leaks. And I'll get to it. They admit it. Leaks from a BSL-4 lab, which means Ebola, coronavirus, anthrax, all the good ones. Now here they're saying a month later, they're going, oh, vaping and stuff, because all the people have cancer and they're all dying. It's vaping. Why? Because we don't know what's happening. So we'll just call it vaping. There has been nearly 200 cases of the vaping-related respiratory illness spanning 22 states, including the Maryland cases. Symptoms include shortness of breath, pain when breathing or coughing, fever, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, according to the release. Sounds like it could be the vaccine. I'm joking. All cases required hospitalization. It is unclear if any cases came from Frederick County. The Maryland Department of Health does not release locations of cases because of privacy concerns. Isn't that a big change? We don't release the cases. We can't tell you where there are. That's a privacy concern. Not with COVID Clown World, though. We're going to make sure you have detailed numbers of cases that are totally arbitrary based on 1,000 different metrics that are completely liberal, as they keep telling us, that will err on the side of your safety, right? Of course. But back then they said, no, we can't tell you. I wonder why they didn't want you to know where exactly that was happening. Isn't that telling? And then it goes on to say, a spokeswoman for Frederick Memorial Hospital could not respond to the request for comment on Wednesday. Clearly, they're just being open, transparent about the whole thing. It is unclear what causes the respiratory illness. So they don't know, yet they're willing to claim it was vaping. Isn't that interesting? No vaping device, brand, or substance has even been linked to the illness. But wait a minute. Didn't you just say related to vaping? Yeah, this is the kind of reporting that even local, could you call the Frederick News Post mainstream media? Clearly, they're playing the same game. If it hasn't been linked to it, how can you possibly call it a vaping illness? Because that was the agenda. So Fort Detrick has a leak, right? It says right here, working with anthrax, Ebola, smallpox, and coronaviruses. I always find it telling they left that one out. Coronaviruses have been worked on there for a long time. Easy to look up, by the way. So they have a leak. A month later, we see vaping illnesses popping up all over the place. Isn't that very telling? Let's take this moment to jump over to the map and see what it actually looks like for people that might not realize, the proximity of all this. All right. So here we are. This is Detrick, Maryland, which is where Fort Detrick is, right? So, excuse me, Frederick, Maryland. So here is what we're talking about. Here's North Carolina, right here. Okay, so North Carolina is down here, which is where the material was being sent to China, which logically you could argue probably came there to Fort Detrick as well. Just my opinion. But in any case, we know that they're working on this material in North Carolina. We also know they're working on this material in Fort Detrick. And we also know that we had weird vaping illnesses popping up in North Carolina and Virginia and Pennsylvania and 22 other states, but all, kind of clustered right around this area in a very strange way. And remember then that months later, after this thing had continued to get crazy, we saw, or technically, no, I see what I keep doing is I keep thinking of the wrong date in 2021. So the World Military Games, let's see, 2020, October 2019. Okay, so August is when they shut down. A month later is when we started to see all these cases spreading everywhere. And then a month later is when the US military shipped out of Washington and went all the way over to China for the World Military Games, while they were there. Now, understand, first of all, it should be clear that this is something that, this is, by the way, after it was reported in the US by independent media. I think this is when China picked this up and was pushing the same idea. Maybe because it's true, maybe because they want to use propaganda to hit the United States, right? It's all possible. They said China's media reported this might have been a case. It doesn't matter. You should consider it for yourself. The idea that the US government went to the World Military Games in Wuhan and were right there. We're walking through that wet market. People, and there were the reports of American soldiers being sick during this process. And then we also remember that supposedly the most talented military in the world, who regularly takes first place in this exact thing, oddly finished subpar across the board. And oddly had no social media presence when they normally do. All those things are easy to look up. Why is all that? I'm not telling you I know for sure, but I think when you add up all these things together, it starts to make a really strange picture that any detective or investigator would go, okay, that is something to look into. Can you trace this back? Certainly possible. Now, in any case, realize that this is the area we're talking about, and the timeline is exactly in line with how this could have gone. Exactly. Now, going back to, I wish they could let me share two things at once. That would be fantastic. Here we go. So, going forward, here's the change.org. Where was the date this began? This is from, looks like 5 years ago. They're talking at the very least, right? So in any case, what it's saying, so it could be 2015, 2016, or maybe earlier, if you go all the way down the comments, but just recognize what it says. Change.org. Clean up deadly Army chemical weapons spill at Fort Detrick that created cancer cluster. Almost 15,000 people signed this. Why is this not something we can talk about? There's clearly something going on. Now, just in case those weren't here in the beginning, I actually wish that I had the larger clip that I used to play. I don't want to take the time to try to find it, but this is the intro I just played. Now, listen to what this is, the reality in Fort Detrick that your government does not want you to see.
We have over 1,300 documented cancer victims right now, just in a 1 mile radius. I'll be quite honest with you, it's changed my life so radically. Sometimes I don't even know who I am.
1,300 people in a 1 mile radius. And what's causing so much sickness? It turns out all these victims have one thing in common. They live next to a military base called Fort Detrick.
Well, what do you know, right? I have to remember to grab that actual full document. It's actually not very long. And it's well worth your time. One of the only groups I've seen actually dig into this story, and it is huge. I mean, look, guys, there are organic grassroots groups that are pushing back in Frederick, Maryland, going like, my family's all died of cancer. Like this guy, the guy that was talking in that video, this is the saddest thing you could imagine. His wife, his daughter, his son, they've all died. And he's just sitting here dealing with this when his neighbors got ovarian cancer, his other neighbors got this cancer, they've all got, like, this is crazy. And remember, we're talking about the same location that has had one leak every 3 days for 7 years, according to the CDC. And we're not supposed to think about whether this is causing something? Here, this is November 24th, 2019. CDC inspection findings reveal more about Fort Detrick research suspension, right? So August, suspended. We're already seeing vaping illness, we're told, pop out all over the country, 22 states, 39 dead. According to what they tell us, by the way. I guarantee you, if this is what we think, there's all kinds of more deaths that probably just got pushed away as flu or whatever else, the reverse of what's happening now. But so here we are, November, month later, or excuse me, after the month, I'm an idiot. I was thinking October, after August, so August to November, Fort Detrick reported 2 breaches of containment earlier this year. 2 of them, turns out, not just one. So does that mean they were both at the same time? Probably not. So when did the second one happen? It happened either it happened either just before that or afterward. Isn't that interesting? And it says, leading to the Centers for Disease Control halting its very high-level research. The U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRID, announced Friday that it would restart its operations on a limited scale. So take note of the fact that they have leaks, issues, vaping illness outbreaks and clusters, as they call it, the CDC calls it an outbreak. World Military Games is leaving right a month before this, and they're restarting their operations right before this all begins. The 2 breaches reported by U.S. AMRID to the CDC demonstrated a failure of the Army laboratory to, quote, implement and maintain containment procedures sufficient to contain select agents and toxins. It's incredible. The laboratory, a failure of the laboratory to implement and maintain the containment procedures sufficient to contain things like anthrax, coronaviruses, Ebola. Why in the world are we even letting these maniacs play with these toys? As it says, level 3, level 4, BSL level 3, level 4, which means they work on all the things we just talked about. The highest levels of containment that they apparently can't manage over and over and over. But yeah, let's keep going. Well, let's jump up to April 1st, 2020, right? So we're in full swing of this COVID illusion. CDC lifts shutdown order on Army bio. So removing it, we're basically allowing them at a second date to go back to work at a second time because they're totally good with what they're doing, though. I honestly think this is more probably, if you know, my instincts that there's something more being covered up than anything else. And that's what was happening. That's why when they had the shutdown in 2019, right before all this started, that they were very quickly hidden national security. Easy to look up. People were going, what's going on? What happened there? National security. We can't tell you. Now, why would that be? Why would it be national security about something that actually directly affects Frederick, Maryland, or the people around it? They're already screaming about cancer and God knows what else they're doing. But national security. Probably because national security is the blanket they throw over anything they don't want you to see. Well, again, recognize that we're talking about the transition from 2019, August, into 2020. When if this is accurate, that would mean Fort Detrick lost control of something or let something go that hurt people in the United States and spread all through the United States in a catastrophic way. And we just ignored it, called it the flu, did whatever else, which, by the way, also shows you this is not what they say it is today, which shows you that it is just a severe flu, but still definitely killed people just like the flu does every year, tens of thousands of people every year, according to them. So unless you point at it and say, oh, an outbreak, people might just go, well, I feel pretty sick. It's the flu. People die from the flu every year. And you know what? The people that are dying from the flu are probably sitting there going, God, this is crazy. I've never felt this in my life. But it's still the flu because it was severe. You see? So people that are feeling that today, I've never felt this ever before. Well, could be anything. As well as, guess what also the flu does? You lose taste and smell and all the same things. We've all had that with the flu. I don't know why we're weirdly associating that only with COVID-19. Sort of like the ground glass opacity was only COVID when they wanted it to be. But think about the timeline. Let's jump over to, so here, November, we're in November. Here's October. October 5th, 2019. Now ask yourself, first of all, if they're reporting 22 of these cases all over the place, like, well, I guess because they're claiming it's vaping, right? But doesn't that mean that some of them anywhere would have been like maybe accidentally reported as flu or something? Well, no, then it's just odd that there's nothing happening there. But watch what happens when you get up to November, right? So November is when they started working again. And November is when this has been given time to spread across the United States. And we see a catastrophic reality. That is, in my opinion, I don't think I've ever seen one this bad. And look at North Carolina, look at Maryland, look at that same area right there. Exactly from the end of 2019 into the beginning of 2020. Doesn't that seem perfect? And also weirdly, notice how this horrible flu season just keeps going well past when it normally stops. And then right about the time when they needed to keep increasing the numbers, it just goes, boom, disappears. Gone forever. All right. With a couple of little weird pops, which kind of, I think, shows you their inability to keep all of these from being reported. Like, how is it possible they can be very high, like the highest possible level in Iowa and nothing else? Right. Because that makes perfect sense. It's utterly ridiculous. But just so you're clear, looking at, say, March, April, going forward into September, let's take a quick look back at 1819. Right? You can see that there is still a lot going on. In a time when, in this area, 20 to 21, or specifically actually 2021 is just a big laughing joke. I mean, this is just absurd. It's 0, nothing. It's all green. In some cases, just white, which means there's nothing being reported. But going back to this exact one, you'll find that in March, it just dies, right? It just goes away after one of the most extreme areas. The point being, guys, something was happening right here. Exactly correlated with all of this. Now, does that mean it's exactly the case? No, it could be something else. But what else? And why would we assume it was something that doesn't have the same amount of evidence and data points connecting to it? Seems like a choice, doesn't it? Any honest investigator would realize that this is a huge thing to investigate. And by the way, there's been a lot of reports. This is just one of them. The one that I think goes the farthest back, of plenty of people, including Calgary University, saying, look, we have evidence of this all the way back in 2013 from frozen waste samples. Right? It says their research shows that SARS-CoV-2 may have been evolving slowly since 2013. And when you dig into this, the scientists very clearly say this is almost certainly the same thing. So it's not SARS-CoV-1, is it? But they're claiming it's clearly connected to SARS-CoV-2. So does that mean that this was a thing that got out? Did it happen all the way back then? I mean, what does it ultimately mean? What it does translate to is that there's a lot of evidence this was circulating a lot of other places long before we started pointing at it in China, including Italy, including Japan, including Taiwan. I've shown you all of these, and their governments have said, yeah, we have evidence in like 2019, 2020. No one wants to talk about it. Now, just quickly, I want to just add a bunch of these links for you guys to review, because I know that our website, by and large, is completely they do not let our links pop up when you search for things like everywhere else. And there's a reason for that, because we've been talking about this for a long time. U.S. Army has admitted to conducting hundreds of germ warfare tests on Americans. This is April 28th. This is the one I always point out. The U.S. Army has admitted it has secretly conducted at least 239 germ warfare tests in locations across the country, targeting unsuspecting Americans, right? This is 2018. Not a secret. But we're pretending like that wouldn't happen today. Of course not. Even though it's the same government. In fact, a lot of the same people even. U.S. government exposed for conducting biowarfare experiments in San Francisco that killed U.S. citizens. This is Operation Sea Spray, which we've reported many times. That's a fact. Here's a good one from 2018. Secret U.S. biowarfare agenda. Geoengineering in action, evidence-free claims, and political revolution. A bunch of different topics. It is the daily wrap-up. But the good one was about the idea that, don't forget, that the Pentagon has admitted to having 25, at least 25 biolaboratories, or specifically Pentagon biolaboratories in 25 different countries. Right. The thing that they pretend they're not supposed to be doing anymore. Right? We don't manipulate, but let's pretend like they're also just working on vaccines in everyone else's countries, because that totally adds up, doesn't it? Easy stuff to look up, guys. If all you do is buy what the government tells you, you're going to be deceived. Here's a good one. Scientists create shape-shifting cell-sized robot that could change the world. January 5th, 2015? Well, you know what that reminds me of? Johns Hopkins researchers engineered tiny shape-changing machines that deliver medicine efficiently to the GI tract. Oh, that was in November 2020? Well, it sure seems like they had it long before then, huh? Because this is seemingly the same thing. Isn't that funny? So it's like a repackaging, and it's about getting us to want the thing that they need us to use for years, and social engineering. Scientists create the shape-shifting cell-sized robot that could change the world, right? And how is that? Of course, but medicine and all the same things that they're now pushing today. Well, don't forget, virus-sized transistors. This is Charles Lieber. Charles Lieber, at the time, the world's leading scientist in regard to nanowires, specifically transistors that were the size of viruses. Nanotechnology that mimicked viruses. Interesting, isn't it? This is the guy that gets shuttled away right when all this starts, in a very weird story, which I believe I have up right here. Yeah, I reported this on January 29th, 2020, guys. It's just funny how this is, still only discovered now. Chinese national arrested smuggling U.S. bio-research vials into China. This was one of the people that got arrested at the same time he did. And this is one Chinese national that had U.S. biomaterial in their sock from Beth Israel Hospital trying to bring it over into China. The point is that we were talking about this stuff all the way back then. And this is a guy who is working on things that very clearly seem to align with the agenda of the technocratic revolution. And we need to ask ourselves whether this is in fact possibly what is happening today. I'm just simply saying it's an obvious question to ask. If this guy was working on nanotech that mimics viruses, is it not possible that that got out somehow? If it mimics viruses, wouldn't it then go on to do this? Yes. And it's the same concept that if you do the research on this stuff, and I'm not saying I know that as a matter of fact, but we need to think about these possibilities and why this stuff has been clearly a direction and this guy just gets disappeared right in the beginning. We shouldn't be afraid to ask these questions. Scientists accuse DARPA of genetically, Scientists accuse DARPA, the group that's currently involved with all the stuff they're working on for this new medical future, of genetically modifying insects for bioweapons to spread agricultural viruses. We've talked about this too. Insect allies, they tried to call it, when doctors around the world sent out notes that said, this is a biowarfare program. Nobody should trust this. They kept doing it anyway because they don't care what we think. 2020. The long and sordid history of U.S. government bioweapons research and testing on unwitting civilians. This is one of the earlier ones I did, February 2020, where I get into the history of what they're capable of and what they've done. This one was February 9th, 2020, Dr. Boyle, coronavirus censorship. Israel still bombing Gaza. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Never stops. Mapping out vast West Bank annexations. Yeah, because that doesn't have anything to do with what's happening now. Well worth your time to understand that people like Dr. Boyle, and plenty have pointed this out. And finally, HIV-like mutation in coronavirus discovered as Israel suddenly announces vaccine, February 27th, 2020. A lot to talk around this. And of course, interesting that they're all of a sudden discussing this in Congress. Dr. Fauci says, quote, NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute. Verifiable lies, by the way. Interesting, though. And by the way, even Rand Paul said some lies in this exchange. Interesting, though, that we now see this playing out in Congress, isn't it? You know what TLAV and others were discussing in the very beginning and were censored for. And remember, guys, none of these people are on your side. Do not forget that. But pretty interesting that August 27, 2020, right when this was happening in Fort Detrick and the vaping spreading and all the same things happening, NIH awards $7.5 million grant to EcoHealth Alliance months after uproar over political interference, right? So they're continuing to fund the group that they know is funneling money to Wuhan to continue the research that we know they were doing. Whatever Fauci wants to say, it's on paper. We can see it. Gain-of-function research, which was shuttled away from Fort Detrick and U.S. areas over to China. This was after they claimed they were stopping it, but we can see on paper that they did not do that, and they continued to fund it from Obama to Trump, and to Trump to Biden. They're continuing. Look, if you right this moment, they're still funding other research in China. That's not, I don't know why I showed you that in the beginning when this was all called out. And all the right media wanted to say is, look, they did this and that's it. Nope, Trump didn't stop it. They're currently still funding research all over China right now with EcoHealth Alliance, with Fauci, with the NIH. It's amazing how blind people are to points they don't want to see that counter their political narrative. The two-party illusion will do that to you. Here he is awarding money to EcoHealth Alliance that's then being shuttled over to Wuhan. This is the point. It's obvious this is happening. Peter Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance has hidden almost $40 million in Pentagon funding and militarized pandemic science by Sam Husseini. This is on December 16th, 2020, right? So we're not funding that as we continue to fund that. It's a joke. And don't forget, guys, it's still going. Right? They may not be claiming to, or maybe they're not sending things over to Wuhan, but there's clearly still research going on in China. And it doesn't. Ask yourself this: why does it even matter if they're passing it off to China? Maybe EcoHealth Alliance is doing it in the U.S. Maybe it doesn't. This is the point: is the research is continuing. Department of Health and Human Services, EcoHealth Alliance, dates: start date June 1st, 2004, end date 2025. Still going. I mean, it's just very plain and obvious. And all we want to do is trust what they say. Gods have faith in Fauci or whatever people are saying today. Like, it's just ridiculous.